Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar on OpenLMIS hosted by Digital Square. For those of you who are new to Digital Square, we connect health leaders with resources necessary for digital transformation. One of the many ways we do that is by hosting webinars like this to help our global goods community thrive. So today we are here to make a second go at learning about OpenLMIS's recently conducted IP exercise to define IP parameters to ensure its growth as an open source global good with a thriving partnership with Vital Alliance, a private sector company. So in this webinar, OpenLMIS is going to share their journey of approaching the IP exercise, some key considerations and lessons learned. A few quick house rules before we jump in. This webinar, as you may have noticed, is going to be recorded and will be posted on our wiki. We'll also share slides, and we ask that you mute yourself during the presentation portion so that we can hear our speakers, and then raise your hand for the Q&A so that we can call on you for us to ask questions. Our panelists today are Brian Taliesin, Josh Samore, and David Crew-Brown. Brian has been a part of the OpenLMIS community from before its inception, supporting the common requirements that went into the core functionality, as well as the vaccine additions added to V3. He's also a longtime advocate for interoperability standards and especially the data flow between supply chain and other health information systems. Josh is the software architect behind OpenLMIS V3, which re-architected OpenLMIS to achieve governance through code to realize shared investment and shared benefit. Since its release of version 3, Josh has served as a community steward and has helped the community understand which IP it has and how to approach evaluating licensing options during the stewardship transition. And then lastly, but not least, David is the GM of Vital Alliance, an organization that partners with donors, ministries of health, suppliers, private sector and faith-based organizations to transform humanitarian and pharmaceutical supply chains in Africa and emerging economies. He is a professional industrial engineer and has 24 years of experience in supply chain, predominantly in FMCG sector, but more recently in the pharmaceutical supply chain and in the private and public sector in sub-Saharan Africa. All right, over to you, Brian.
Great, thank you so much. And I couldn't be more excited to be talking with you all again here today about this exciting topic on intellectual property. But in general, maybe do a little bit of stepping back a moment. And Josh, if you want to sort of advance to the next slide. As was mentioned briefly around the aspect of shared investment and shared benefit, OpenLMIS has been around now for over a decade, and largely I sort of came out of some 2008 discussions on multiple donors, many of those you see there on that top row, that were investing in sort of siloed supply chain systems for various different healthcare products. And so a big component of that was that, can we have all of those partners, the JSIs, the Chemonics, Village Reach, Path, AMP, UNFPA, Softworks, Clinton Foundation, et cetera, as well as other software providers that Soldevello, ThoughtWorks, BAO, OpenSRP, NextLeaf, ONA. How can we sort of have all of those different software components sort of working together for everyone's benefit? And so that aspect of that particular journey sort of led us to the code contributions that were happening as part of OpenLMIS. And so we had the initial versions that are implemented in multiple countries, but then with the re-architecture that Josh will speak a little bit more about within V3, really was looking around how do we make that code a bit more sort of reusable and sustainable for new implementations. And so with that, you can go ahead to the next slide. And OpenLMIS itself, there's all these different pieces that were into it. And this was driven out of sort of the country requirements and country demand for that. The bread and butter of OpenLMIS was largely around the digitization of the supply chain systems that were largely in a paper-based model around requisitions and order fulfillment. Then with that, of just knowing what's on the shelves, the stock inventory management was added into that mix. But of course, you can't just have the data input into the system. There really was an important aspect of being able to drive data for decision making with the analytics and reporting. And then finally, some other additional modules. One more recently being added initially from what OpenSRP was be able to provide through integration, but then even more recently with a mobile application. And then, of course, with the importance around vaccine management, there is the whole aspects of tracking the work, the viability of the cold chain, and then even as COVID and the equipment management has come online, adapting that for other types of equipment and the functional status of those. And so all of those sort of software features were added into this overall mix, and multiple software developers were contributing to this particular code and sort of ensuring that what we're doing is sort of sustainable, fits to the overall feature and functionality of it, and is also unencumbered as part of an open source licensing model. And go ahead to the next slide. And I've mentioned sustainability multiple times. The aspects of OpenLMIS for the past decade has largely been funded through that joint contribution by multiple donors, USAID, and actually starting off with the Rockefeller Foundation, but then USAID, as well as with Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and others that have been helping us to continue to build out the features and functionality. Yet, as we've sort of seen that core management with the most recent security issues that have sort of come out there is a need for somebody to be able to sort of continue to monitor the functionality and the sustainability of that software set. And so Village Reach, who was the previous main steward of OpenLMIS, took on themselves of looking at who is the appropriate partner for the future. And we're really excited through overwhelming support from our governance community of OpenLMIS to partner with Vital Alliance with their their large platform, as well as the presence across sub-Saharan Africa. And I'll show you a little bit more on that next slide. So we sort of saw this great sort of partnership with Vital Alliance, having already been doing a lot of work through One Network Enterprise, as well as Imperial Logistics, which is sort of the joint venture that created Vital Alliance, and their presence in countries along with the OpenLMIS deployments. And so there's, I think, a strong ability in supply chain to be able to really scale up and be able to utilize the capabilities of the network, as well as logistics support that Imperial has been providing, to be able to rapidly increase the presence of what OpenLMIS is able to offer. There's others from Vital Alliance that are on the call here, so feel free to continue to add questions into the chat. And then during our Q&A sessions, David and Pranil will be able to speak to more about what services they're able to provide. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Josh.
All right, thanks, Brian. So as Brian was just mentioning, we really created this case study over the past last year, to really dive into, within this context of sustainability, what kind of IP considerations, should we have? And so the first part here is, let's just look at why did we create this case study. First, we wanted to really understand the type of intellectual property that we have within OpenLMIS, and that includes things that we own and things that are owned within the broader community. And then we also wanted to make sure that we were looking at our license, especially with regard to revenue for that sustainability, that financial sustainability. and any options that we had, within that. We had to keep in mind that while we own OpenLMIS depends on a lot of other open source software. And so we also need to make sure that we're keeping those upstream dependencies in mind as well. And then we also want to make sure that while we're going through all of this, we're retaining an open source community. There's been a constant thread of always making sure that we maintain that open source community for that shared investment and benefit. So as we are getting into this case study, first let's just do like a very high level overview of what is IP and what is licensing, just to set some terms. And the first is IP, or intellectual property, is essentially anything that one creates and it applies to some given work, some intellectual work. The author or the creator of that IP owns that work, owns that IP by default, unless they assign it away. And so an example of that is if you're an employee, you often sign an employee contract that assigns that IP to your employer. Similarly, many organizations, when signing contracts, they're going to have specific sections in those contracts that deal with IP and determine where that IP that is created is assigned after it's created. So IP it just applies, again, to that thing that is created, and oftentimes, we need to sign that IP away, to other entities. So that's IP. It kind of exists, as a background thing. You own it as soon as you create it. And then licensing is really dealing with, how that IP owner allows others to use that IP or extend it, alter it, repackage it, etc. Anything that the terms of that license, grant or don't grant. And really all of that is, part of that particular license. And when we're working in open source software, there are many different open source licenses. And for an example, one of the best known initiatives out there, the Open Source Initiative, has about 100 different licenses to choose from that give, different terms for how to use, how to extend, how to alter, repackage, all that sort of stuff. So that's just at a very high level, brief overview. What is IP as opposed to licensing? It's these two pieces while we're working through the rest of this case study. So when we're looking at the elements of IP, we're really considering 5 different elements. And in the center here, we have software code. But when we say software code, just remember, actually, we really mean software code and all of the documentation that goes with it. But we simplified this just down to software code, but we really mean documentation as well. And when we're thinking about all of that code or documentation that exists in the center there, we have these 5 pieces that are around it. And the first is inbound contributions. So you can think of that as software that's being written by a software developer, and they're contributing that to OpenLMIS. So that's things that make up OpenLMIS. The other thing that we have, though, is upstream dependencies. So as that software developer is working, they often will pull in another open source library or another project, like a database, something like that. And those pieces also have, those are owned by someone else, and they have a license that grants us the ability to use that. So we have to keep those in mind as well. All of that comes out into the license that OpenLMIS then grants to anyone that uses OpenLMIS, either directly as a customer or as a dependency in their own downstream project. That's a license that OpenLMIS then uses to grant usage of what we have. And all those things have to be, meshing well. There's also these 2 things down here at the bottom. We won't get too much into trademark in this case study. We touched on it briefly, but know that it's out there. It applies to brands and logos. You could think of any, well-known brand that's out there. Those are pieces of trademark that cover who can use that trademark, or not. There's also copyright in software. When we're thinking about copyright, we're really thinking about, that IP that's behind it, right? That software code or that documentation, and who owns that piece. So those are the five elements that we considered in this case study. And then what we found important are these pieces here. First, we found the license, of course, is important. And the two most common sources of licenses, I should say, here are the open source initiative, often used for code, and the Creative Commons, which is often used for documentation. So licenses is important. Of course, the inbound contributions are also important. We'll get more into this in the next slides. But really considering where a contribution to OpenLMIS is coming from and how that contribution is owned and how it's licensed to OpenLMIS is important. And we found that there is a template generator out there that makes some of this easy, that among others, you can get templates from. And one of those is the Harmony agreements. And then we're looking also at dependencies. We really want to make sure, and if you're not, a direct software developer on a project like OpenLMIS these days, there are lots and lots of dependencies. There's a whole supply chain of dependencies that we think about nowadays, and you can think of those in terms of hundreds or thousands of different dependencies. So we really want to know, what those dependencies are. We want to make sure that we're enforcing a policy on those dependencies to make sure we're only selecting dependencies that are compatible with the license that we're licensing OpenLMIS out as. So that's important to keep in mind. And of course, we're doing all of this in terms of revenue for sustainability. And so we're using a strong copyleft license, and we want to make sure that we're considering how that impacts the community's ability to sell access to value-added services. And we'll get more into this as well in the next slides. So let's go there. But also, again, trademarks, we don't get too much into this in this case study, but again, make sure that you understand that they're out there. Again, these are on brands and logos, and that sort of thing. So what we found for OpenLMIS, first is who owns the IP. And primarily we found that open ownership is held at Village Reach and JSI. And we also decided that ownership is so far going to remain unchanged. One of the primary reasons for that is, especially for the ownership at Village Reach, we're going to ensure that there's a fiscal sponsor that matches the donor rules and nonprofit requirements. So when someone wants from one of those donors to donate money to a project that OpenLMIS has, having that legal entity that is a nonprofit that's back there is useful for that exchange. So we're going to keep that for now, but we're also considering that longer term, we really want, we think that there should be a better fiscal sponsor that could own OpenLMIS and perhaps other open source global health goods, and that this would be a good way to go to ensure that OpenLMIS has a longer term fiscal sponsor. We also wanted to look at the license. So we have a strong copyleft license. It's AGPL v3, and we're keeping it. That strong copyleft license ensures that the community is what we have today is going to be strongly protected as open source. And strong copyleft licenses like AGPL often get a bad reputation in as being not business friendly. But one of the things we found is that the OpenLMIS v3 microservice architecture is going to kind of sidestep a little bit of that, and it's going to allow make sure that we have a strong license, as the first bullet point has. Make sure we have a strong license to protect the open source community, but it's also going to allow people to build new microservices onto that architecture that aren't derivative products. And they can build new services, license under a proprietary license, and sell access to those value-added services. So in part, our license works well to both protect the community and make sure that it can be extended into the private sector as well. So continuing on with some of this, when we're looking at our upstream dependencies, basically we're just making sure, again, that we're considering the open source initiative licenses. That's the 100 or so licenses that are in there. We want to make sure that our upstream dependencies are all meeting those, and that makes it easy for us to enforce that policy of having an open source license. And probably one of the biggest changes that we're putting in place is we found that we didn't have a formal inbound contribution agreement or contribution assignment. So we're actually adopting two different changes, both within the same concept, and that is to make sure that any inbound contribution, so anytime someone writes code, writes documentation, and contributes it to OpenLMIS, they'll have to sign a contributor assignment agreement for most, and some will be allowed to sign a contributor license agreement. Those are very close, and there's not there's not a huge distinguishment from our perspective, between those. But essentially, the contribution agreement is going to ensure we know who owns that IP. We want to be deliberate and we want to be accountable to make sure we know who owns it and how that piece is licensed. And when we're thinking about a CAA or the contributor assignment agreement, that helps us ensure that we have fewer known IP owners, intellectual property owners, and it makes it simpler to track what's owned by who and ensure the license is appropriate for the greater community. And the CLA, or the contributor license agreement, gives flexibility to the community for select community members to contribute, retain IP, and agree that the contribution can always be relicensed to another open source license if needed. So this is really more for the like institutional type owners that might create IP out there. Like if you have a student at a university, usually that university is not going to give up IP. And so we can still allow that student at the university to work on some OpenLMIS pieces. And we can still make sure that we're being deliberate and accountable, ensuring that that work is always going to be open source for the community. And we know who it is and who owns it and those sorts of pieces. So that would be our biggest change. And again, we'll touch briefly on trademark. So currently, trademark for OpenLMIS is not registered. It does fall, we found, within common law use, and it could be registered later. So if we ever do want to register, it is important for us to track when we're using it and where we're using it. So these, again, are our brands, our logos, that sort of thing. So it's important that we're tracking, when we're creating new logos, where we're using those sorts of things. And we found that we could register it. So registration could be useful in the future to police the brand. But so far, we haven't found that to be necessary. We don't think that that's a big value add to the community. And this would be, right now it would be if someone were misusing that brand or something along those lines. But so far we haven't found that. And we also found that we could do that in the future if it does become an issue. So right now it's within our norms. The community use is completely within our norms. We're not going to register that trademark right now. There's a whole process, and it can vary, it can be complicated depending on where you are, but there is a process to do that if we wanted to do that in the future. So as an overview, just all the pieces that we just went over. First is, we want to be sure, we knew who owns what in the community: code, documentation, and trademarks. We wanted to know what that is and who owns it, who the author is, who where contracts alter that ownership. We found those things out. Those are really important, and a lot of work that often is ignored in the beginning of open source projects. But when you get to this stage, it really is important to know who owns it and where that piece is coming from. We also are adopting, and again, this is our biggest change and really a good thing for a lot of open source projects to consider, is how IP for inbound contributions is going to work, right? So we're adopting a contribution agreement, which primarily is going to be this CAA and optionally the CLA. And those are good pieces to go back to. Again, there's a template generator out there for you to make it easier. We also want to make sure that we're really know what our license is, how it works, how it applies to our IP, and those sorts of pieces. And right now we're staying, continuing to stay with our strong copyleft license, the AGPL v3. It's also really important to know what you depend on. right, what your upstream dependencies are, right? These days, software is built in a complex software stack, and you have a lot of different dependencies, and it's important to understand, who owns, not so much who owns it, but more, what license they're granting you when you're using it. And so that's something to keep track of. Make sure you have a way to enforce those upstream dependency policies. And then finally, of course, for us, revenue for sustainability is really important. And so we're staying with our strong copyleft license. That's enabled though by our architecture. If you're considering, revenue for sustainability for your project, consider the architecture, consider, how your license works with derived works, and how those things interact. And the final part here is really make sure, the overall piece, the overall thing to take away from this is be deliberate. Be deliberate with who owns what, how it's licensed, understand how these basic pieces work. And if you do have, an architecture and a license that might grant you, some flexibility, then consider that. And certainly at some point, you're going to want to consult your own legal counsel. We certainly did when we went through this case study. It was very helpful. So this can give you an introduction to how all these pieces work. But at the end of the day, you'll also want to take this back to your own legal counsel. And I think with that, I'm going to hand it over to David.
Thanks, Josh, and thanks, Brian, for the upfront introduction. As you saw there from Josh's final slide, there, be deliberate and always look at the fine print, because sometimes it will need to be reviewed in detail just to see. I think when Brian opened the presentation today, he spoke about the shared investment, shared benefit, and really, when we look at what that means in terms of OpenLMIS, for our environment, we really think around, everyone can contribute and make OpenLMIS better for all. And I think that really is a focus for us, is how do we make sure that this system that is used across almost 12 countries now continues to grow, continues to gain momentum, and continue to improve with contributions that are being made. But that needs to be, as kind of Josh pointed out now, managed very carefully, but hopefully be able to be put into a greater, almost core product that then can be shared back to the community. I think a couple of points that we wanted to make from our side as Vital Lions and the new stewards of OpenLMIS is, if you look through the implementation, we have seen that although open source means that the software is free, but there are costs involved with it. And if we think around, what that would look like in the public or private sector, there's costs involved with hosting infrastructure. There's also implementation costs when you're actually doing the implementation, and then what we call ongoing support. And those are all to be considered in the space. I think, when one talks about that new functionality, as Josh pointed out, there is a way for us now to potentially get a new functionality developed and then charge that as a fee for use type of model, and maybe other models around software as a service. But really looking at how does one continue to almost build out the core and then start bolting on some additional functionality on the sides that could be useful and required in either the public or the private sector environment. And for us as stewards, moving from this donor-funded environment to needing to almost making OpenLMIS stand up on its own without that support from the donor environment, it really is around how does one create sustainable opportunities. And there's a whole lot of good ideas that we have as a team to be able to do that. But it also requires a strong community. And that community really, I think people on the call today and people in our OpenLMIS network, and really be calling on that community to continue to support, continue to contribute, continue to expand their own implementations, and through that be able to contribute back to OpenLMIS. Josh, I think if we can move on to the next, and I think it's the last slide from our side. So if we then look at what is that sustainability, so a couple of ideas around the sustainability and what one can do within this environment to make this OpenLMIS sustainable. Open source environment needs still some maintenance, some oversight. I think Brian started with a comment around some security risks. So end of last year, there was some security risks that we had to check that OpenLMIS does not get impacted by. So, what are the things that need to be done to be able to provide that core function, but still make it a sustainable view? And so some of the early thoughts we have is really linking with other systems. So Vital Alliance as an organization really focuses broadly on providing supply chain services into the pharmaceutical healthcare environment. And really at the heart of Vital Alliance, it's to link up with other systems and processes to try and expand the supply chain offering, help ministries of health, help countries and organizations mature in their supply chain, and look at how that is done through enablement systems. OpenLMIS would be one of those. We've recently completed an integration between OpenLMIS and One Network as an example, and that creates the capability for us to provide high-end solutions such as demand planning, if I can call out one, that you could then do on the back of having rich data and having other tools that are integrated, and then start talking about what is the service offering. There's also support implementation, again, looking at what does that look like and mean, and how does one potentially continue to support, largely driven by implementing partners that are familiar to the community, but how does one support those and make the implementations of OpenLMIS simpler? What do we need to invest to make it what we would typically call simpler, better, faster, cheaper, and in that enable improvement, enable efficiencies within the OpenLMIS implementation and longevity. There's also other avenues, and one of the avenues that has recently been reviewed by CHI, and if you were at the community forum that happened for OpenLMIS earlier in the week, you would have heard a report back from Lakshmi from CHI around that data commercialization. And really the heart of that opportunity is to look at the data that's coming out of OpenLMIS and potentially other sources, and to consolidate that data and to share that data with suppliers, with interested parties, and that will then be at a cost to be able to use that data and get the data access. That will be of a benefit to the Ministry of Health, and really in that whole scope to try and find a way of turning data available into a funding mechanism that can then pay for services, that can then pay for licenses and expanded offering. So I think in closing from my side, really wanted to say from our point of view as Vital Alliance, to continue to provide support to the core product. I think that's really our commitment, to keep the integrity of OpenLMIS going, to support the system itself, to support the community, and to continue to build out the community. Ensure the product doesn't fork. I think that's something that we feel is close to heart. Make sure that people continue using the core functionality of OpenLMIS and don't start developing functionality that's not aligned to the standard, because that then means as we start improving functionality with new enhancements and new developments, a forked version cannot receive those sort of latest version upgrades when they are made available. And then I suppose the last thing from our side is to work with the community and build out further functionality to meet the needs that exist for the OpenLMIS community. So I think in terms of the IP, Josh did a really good job to clearly explain how we're setting things up. We are looking forward to seeing how that movie pans out as we move forward. I think we are well set to be able to manage the complexities within an open source environment. And really from a Vital Alliance point of view, feel we are poised to try and sustainably manage OpenLMIS going forward together with the community that surrounds it. So again, thank you so much for the opportunity to be speaking to you all today. I think if we look at the last slide, there is the case study that you've got access to. I've included just something at the end there in terms of if you're not part of the OpenLMIS community, you can contact Pranil, who's on the call today. He's our community manager, and he will indeed invite you to that community. We try and put out a monthly newsletter as well as engage with our colleagues in the OpenLMIS community forum. So would love to have you as being part of that. I think we're going to pause there and allow for any Q&A that there might be, and see how we can answer any questions that might arise. So maybe back over to Brenda.
Yeah, happy to open this up. Carl has a question in chat. Carl, do you want to come off of mute and ask your question, or I'll give you a second, otherwise I'll read it out.
Sure. Thanks, everyone. This is Kyle Duarte from FHI. I know a few folks here have worked on OpenLMIS in past lives. So the information helps clarify a lot about licensing, IP in and around source code. My question to the team is, how do you separate data ownership from software or product licensing, especially as we're talking about revenue potential on data aggregation, analytics, and other components of that? Thanks.
So I could take a quick stab at that, and maybe Brian and David could follow up. But I mean, at the very basic part of the question, if I understood it right, is, how is data treated? And for OpenLMIS, there's, it's not like there's any claim that OpenLMIS would have on any of the data generated, in any implementation. So if there is going to be any sort of agreement, at least as it is today, that would need to be, started at the implementation level. Otherwise, I don't believe that there's anything in the software license that would say anything about the software license itself. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and maybe to support Josh in that is that if one were to do anything around data, I think it would be a country by country, case by case basis that one would have that conversation. I know that the work that Chai have done in the research, it was specifically speaking to Malawi and Zambia around just their, are they prepared to share the data if there's a revenue source potential? And I think there was a positive response within a certain band of data protection and data confidentiality agreements. But I think it would be a case-by-case basis, and definitely nothing that is as part of a standard implementation contract.
Excellent, thanks both. Are there any other questions? Keep it open for a second. Anyone else? Otherwise, we could wrap up a little early. Okay, what do you all think? I'm going to ask a question to the panelists. What kinds of concerns do you hear from your community when you ask for them to sign a license or join a licensing agreement as they're adding contributions? I know they're open left and they're pretty, and it's still an open license, but what do you hear from your community? Are there concerns other than revenue sharing? Are Are they worried about anything? And how do you handle those situations?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know if I've heard many concerns outside of the, is it open source and will it, be around, tomorrow sort of thing. I think those are the main concerns that I've heard, but perhaps David and Brian, have heard of some others.
Yeah, I think, Brenda, there haven't been specific concerns raised. I think there seems to be a really good working relationships with implementing communities around making sure that when there are what we call specific customizations, that those are made in a way that it can be contributed back to the core product and then shared with the broader community. So I think there's a fairly good collaborative environment. In terms of signing those contracts, I haven't had concerns raised, but that is also fairly new in my in kind of my exposure to that. So maybe there have been other concerns raised, but none that I've been made aware of.
Excellent. Brian, any dad?
No, nothing else to add. They covered it. Thank you.
Excellent. Okay. Any other questions from the audience? Well, in that case, I will say thank you very much for all of you for joining us, as well as to our speakers. Thanks, Cynthia. Glad it was useful. Yeah, and we will send out the recording of this webinar afterwards, as well as share the slides in the next few days. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, David. Thank you, Josh. This was great, and I'm glad that we made a second attempt. This one was a lot smoother. It was a pleasure. Thanks, everyone. Have a lovely day.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you all for attending.
That's all.
Everyone.